constant. They're going bang, 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 down all the time. Every time this engine revs up, that belt wants to expand and fling out, which is going to push on that tensioner. Hey guys, welcome back. Steve here with 6 Star Automotive. I've got a topic today that most might actually think is pretty boring, but I'm going to show you how not boring it really is. But before we get started, as usual, like, subscribe, and hit the bell. Ring my bell, ring my bell. And join me as we talk about serpentine belts. I got some feedback about the intro being a little bit too long, so hopefully that's a little better. I don't know, I thought it was pretty cool, but whatever. So serpentine belts have had a lot of names over the years. They've been called fan belts, V belts, drive belts. I believe the technical name for them now is multi-rib V belts. So most of us don't even think about this guy unless there's a problem, obviously. Just like plenty of other things in our lives, there's so much complexity out there that it really, until there's a problem, who cares? But understanding what's going on here is really helpful to understanding what kind of problems can happen and how you can prevent them from happening in the future. So what does the drive belt actually do? So the purpose of the serpentine drive belt is to take the rotational energy from the crankshaft and use it to power other components like the alternator, your air conditioner, and your power steering. Sometimes the drive belt can even be used to power the water pump. In the 90s, that was kind of transitioned into a job of the timing belt, which we'll get into in another video. On more modern cars, they don't really use timing belts much anymore. They're timing chains, and we can go over that in another video as well. Let me know in the comments if you want one of those. The idea of moving the water pump from a drive belt operated unit to a timing belt operated unit was really just for safety. The likelihood of a drive belt breaking is much higher than the likelihood of a timing belt breaking. So if for some reason your drive belt does fail and your water pump is driven by the drive belt, then your engine could overheat. If it's driven by the timing belt, then at least your water pump will still function. You may lose your alternator, you may lose your AC and your power steering, but at least your engine will still have the coolant circulating. They've kind of transitioned back into serpentine belts powering water pumps now because it's kind of actually a better idea than having it driven by the timing chain. Much more involved in accessing a timing chain driven water pump than an accessory belt driven water pump. But not always that's the case. They do have timing chain driven water pumps. Ford. So what happens in the event of a drive belt failure? So it basically is what you would imagine. The components that are driven by the drive belt no longer function. Most of the time before anything catastrophic like that happens, you have a lot of warning with chirping and squealing, especially on cold startup. So why do drive belts make noise? Let's go over their construction so I can explain. So this is a pretty standard 4-cylinder engine. You're going to have your alternator, your AC, your power steering, a couple of idlers, and then a tensioner assembly over here. So let's take a look at a cross section of this belt. So we're going to pause it right here. So as you just saw from the video, this is the pulley. If we take the pulley sideways and then cut it in half, so you can see the belt looks kind of like this. This is your drive belt. This is this tiny piece of one. There's the cross section that we're looking at right here. So the way that old belts used to work is they'd have one giant V, and that one big V would swedge itself into a pulley, and that's the only contact that it had was on those outside edges. So as the belt wore down, it would kind of push itself down into there, and then it would lose that contact, and they'd be a lot more prone to flopping around, being loose, and making all kinds of racket. So they actually found that if they made a lot of little tiny V's, you would have much more surface area with contact to the pulley, and then much better friction holding onto that drive belt. So over time, these ribs are going to wear out, and it'll actually start looking something like this. Let's do a comparison. You've got the new belt on this side, and you can see how kind of bumpy they are, and that actually helps kind of wedging that into that pulley. The other one here, as it wears down, well, you can see, right? Imagine this in that, right? You're going to have much less surface area, much more likelihood of that to slip inside there. So as the belt wears down, you lose that contact inside of the pulley, which then means you lose friction and you become more prone to slippage. Slippage then creating the noise that you're hearing. Here's an illustration of what slippage looks like. You've got good contact, and then over here you can see how the pulley doesn't actually follow along the belt. That's where that noise comes from. One thing to keep in mind, is that if a belt does end up failing, usually it doesn't just break. Usually what happens is it'll actually fray, and you'll start getting like a chunk of this belt will start to kind of fly, and it'll start slapping around inside the engine compartment. If you see here, you've got little wire harnesses, you've got a crankshaft position sensor stuff around here. A damaged belt can end up damaging other things and causing more repairs. They can wrap around the crankshaft. That's happened many times. I've seen that. Just like what I've been telling you, from the very beginning. It's all about maintenance and inspection. So how do we know when the belt is bad? So it's helpful to have like a go, no-go gauge or a black and white type test instead of being speculative. So we actually have a tool. This is a groove depth tester. I actually had one of my guys make these for me. So if you look in here, if I push you see these little ribs, you'll push those inside of the belt like this. And then you'll wiggle it laterally like so. And if it doesn't move, oops, let me grab a better bite. There we go. And if it doesn't move, that means that your ribs are not very deep inside the belt. So that's the depth, the groove depth is what we're testing. If you do the same thing on this belt, you can actually see this one wiggles around like crazy because there's too much depth in these grooves. That's what we use to determine how worn a belt is. This is a pretty extreme example, but just to kind of show you what they can do. So if you're old enough to remember cars from the 70s and 80s, belts used to be made out of neoprene, and they would crack. So you would never have anything like this happen where you'd get all these super deep grooves, because by then, as the belt bends backwards and forwards, it goes around and it serpentines around all those pulleys. As it bends, the neoprene would crack, and then the chunks of the belt would come off, and it wouldn't last anywhere near as long as the belts nowadays do. So they didn't really have a chance to wear down like this. They would just crack into bits. So nowadays we don't use neoprene for belts anymore. We use a compound called EPDM, or ethylene propylene diene monomer. Basically, it's a rubber that is much more resilient to oxidation, UV exposure, and breaking down over time. So one of the most common failures that we see in drive belts are either the pulleys or the bearings inside of the pulleys or the tensioner assembly. So how does the tensioner assembly work, and what does it even do? We used to adjust belts with a component, and the component would be used as the tensioner. So we'd loosen a component, we'd string the belt on, and then we'd tighten that component, and then you would tighten down that adjuster, and that would be the tension. The problem is it's rubber, so they can change over time. So then the belt gets loose. So they decided to make automatic tensioners, so the tension of the belt can be continually adjusted. So instead of dealing with this stuff and having the belt come back noisy and having to do tension adjustments all the time, they just added an automatic spring-loaded tensioner. The problem is that these tensioners, they move. I mean, it's constant. They're going bang, 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 down all the time. Every time this engine revs up, that belt wants to expand and fling out, which is going to push on that tensioner, and the tensioner is going to have to push back. So another side note is that the tensioner is always going to be on the opposite side of rotation, right? So you don't want to have it spinning this direction and pulling down on the tensioner. So the tensioner will always be on the loose side of the belt. But like I was saying, inside of here is a spring assembly, and every time that spring assembly moves, it's wearing that spring, and then it also has to kind of pivot on the metal inside of the tensioner, and that can start to seize up with rust particles and stuff and make it hard to move. So when it gets pushed out, it doesn't push back like it's supposed to, and we call that a sticking tensioner. Other things that could indicate a problem with your drive belt are warning lights, believe it or not. So if your battery light comes on, it could be that the belt tension is incorrect. If the belt is slipping over the alternator then can't spin. If it can't spin, it can't create electricity, and then you'll have a charging system problem. So one of the reasons why we do diagnosis instead of the battery light comes on, put an alternator in it, like that, it's not that simple. It's actually a lot more complicated than that. We can do what we call an accessory diagnosis. So what we end up doing is, if we have reason to believe that something's wrong in the accessory or drive belt system, we'll take that belt off and then we're going to inspect everything. We're going to move the pulleys laterally like this to see if there's any problem with any of the bearings. We're going to spin all of these idlers and tensioners. We're going to test that tensioner to see if it has proper action and spring back like it's supposed to. Instead of just putting a belt on a car, you want to make sure that everything else that's involved with that belt or related to that belt is okay. You know, the last thing I want and you want is for me to put a drive belt on your car and then you go down the road and in 2 or 3 months you have your tensioner blow up, right? Forget it. Like, we want to make sure that when we're dealing with a system, everything in that system is okay before we give it back, or at least let you know. I mean, I'm not telling you have to do anything, but I just want to make sure that everybody's aware. Like, just like the reason I do these videos, everything we do is about transparency and compassion. We genuinely do care about you and your peace of mind, your safety, and your family, to make sure that things like this you don't have to worry about. So some more uncommon things that can happen with drive belts is misalignment. So if you have a problem with a noise that just will not go away, we actually have tools that will check the alignment of these pulleys with lasers. Usually when they're out of alignment, something happened at some point. It doesn't just necessarily happen. Either a pulley got like reinstalled incorrectly on a power steering pump, or it's got the wrong alternator in it or something like that, and then we have to try and figure out what's going on. But alignment is something that's very, very important. They need to be exactly aligned, or that belt is going to have to go left and then go back right and then go down. And the likelihood of it doing that without making noise is pretty much nil. I think that pretty much covers it. If you guys have any questions, please stick them in the comments. I can answer them. I can actually make an extension to this video or a follow-up or something like that if you guys have any questions about that. Thanks for watching. I'll catch you next time. And remember to come by and experience the 6-star difference for yourself. Hey guys, welcome back. Here, see, there's the voice. And you wonder why there's so much of this in the editing. Vocal cord check. Ring my bell, ring my bell.